to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss Good Friday, which this year falls on April 15th. We have one very big content notification for this episode. During the deep dive, we talk about capital punishment, torture, racism, classism, and mental illness.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive this episode, we are diving deep into capital punishment, which is part of our gospel story for Good Friday.
And in case you were wondering, when you spell the word capital for capital punishments, it's T-A-L, not T-O-L. Because oddly enough, the capital it's referring to is your head, as in decapitation. Oh. Thank you, Wikipedia. So it's spelled with an A and not an O, because it's about your head and not the capital of a country.
Interesting. I always thought it was about the capital of a country, like state execution.
Right.
No.
And when we talk about the death penalty, basically, which is another term for it, we have historically talked about many different ethical and logistical considerations over time, some of which in a more modern sense. Some of those conversations were started in ancient times.
Yes. In our contemporary conversation, there is a lot of conversation about particularly the ways the criminal justice system in the United States is not actually just. So when you do an analysis of race and class, the number of people of color, especially Black people, who are on death row versus white people. Also, class comes into play, not only in who has opportunities for getting their needs met in what our society has decided are legal ways, but also who can afford a good lawyer. Everybody is entitled to a lawyer, someone to be on their side and bringing up their defense, and if you can't afford one, the court will appoint one. And while there are many great court-appointed lawyers, there are also many terrible court-appointed lawyers, and there are many inexperienced court-appointed lawyers, and so that makes it harder for people who are trying not to get the death penalty to avoid getting the death penalty if they don't have the money to pay for their own lawyer.
Yeah.
So those are like big picture criminal justice problems that have a heavy impact on the death penalty, capital punishment, particularly in the United States, because we still have it in many states.
Sure.
The other piece of consideration that is taken into account when deciding if someone is given the death penalty is their mental development or mental health. So to see if they are actually competent both to stand trial and to be held fully responsible for the crime.
On a more individual scale, there's the logistical consideration of keeping the prisoner safe from both outside and inside people who might want to harm them while waiting for the execution, or sometimes even while waiting for the trial. I know that there's been about 1 million westerns based on that storyline.
Mm-hmm. And that was much of the time period of lynching in the United States.
Yeah.
That was fairly intentional, not keeping the prisoner safe until trial because they didn't want a trial. Yeah.
Whereas the westerns that were based on the concept mostly emphasized the fact that executions can be appealed and in some cases commuted, and also the method of execution by the state is going to probably be more quote-unquote humane than one chosen by an angry crowd. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into the concept of humane execution a little later. But also there's the concept of keeping the prisoner from completing suicide while awaiting for either their execution or their sentencing in those cases. And that has been shown to be a logistical problem in a lot of different places, certainly not just the United States.
Mm-hmm. There's also consideration of last-minute reprieves. This is complicated, but there are frequently pushes to commute sentences, to give last-minute reprieves, and that lends itself to the conversation about if something is humane or, in the United States, is not cruel or unusual.
Right.
But there is this push, and we've seen it. Different cases come to light. Not every case gets gets national attention, but there have been several over the last few years who all of the evidence points towards the witness was lying and might actually be either at fault or know who actually is, or the evidence doesn't actually hold up, but because the trial has gone the way the trials have gone, there's not a chance for the person to be retried or to have their appeal heard, and so then it goes to the governor of a state or the president of a state.
And then, of course, there's the question of, does the death penalty actually work as a deterrent to crime, which, at least in the United States, has been repeatedly shown to be no, especially if the other people that the person on death row are dealing with, or the person potentially going to death row are dealing with, are offering fates worse than the death penalty in exchange for crossing them. So the death penalty does not offer a deterrent to crime.
Yeah. And even if that's not the case, it's just, in general, punishment as a deterrent is not effective. What is effective is reparations and reform and helping people get back on their feet, or economic justice in the first place, right? There's a lot of things that you can do.
Which cuts down on crime wildly.
On the front end to decrease both crime and capital punishment. It also costs immense amounts. So as Christians, as followers of Christ, there are a variety of reasons why I believe, at least, that capital punishment is wrong and we should not do capital punishment. But knowing politics the way we do, sometimes the only argument that people listen to is the money argument. And the money argument actually points to that it is way more expensive because of the length of appeals and all of that process for someone to be executed in this country than it is for them to receive a sentence of life in prison.
Yeah.
So if you want to play the money game, which is, not the best reason for deciding things from a faith perspective, it doesn't come out in favor of execution. It comes out in favor of not having capital punishment.
Yeah. And, if you're just interested in lowering the general cost of our bureaucracy in this country, hey, look, you have another alternative.
Ta-da!
And then, of course, there's the question of how much say does the victim's family have? Like, if the family of the person who, like, if we're talking about a murder case, if the family of the person who was killed or attacked is saying, no, we don't want the death penalty, like give them life in prison or do something else, but we don't want them to go through capital punishment, the criminal justice system in America does not have to listen to that, and rather frequently doesn't.
Yeah. Sometimes it does, but...
Yeah, occasionally you hear a story, but it's not something that they're required to do. There are no laws, as far as I'm aware, based on that concept. And I can't imagine the additional pain of, say, losing a family member to violence and then finding out that the person who did it is going to be executed against your will, probably years later. I don't think heaping more pain on those families is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, logistically speaking, there is the concept of how do we humanely, and please understand I am saying the word humanely in quotes, execute someone, which is a whole long list of considerations.
And there's a lot of that humanity has done historically in both practice and methodology. The kind of biggest one to name for this particular episode, because it is Good Friday, is crucifixion. Crucifixion was a Roman method of execution. It is not intended to be humane. It's intended to be torturous. And it's intended to have, they would do it lining up outside the town so that anybody coming in or out would see it. It was usually for people who were resisting oppression, resisting the occupation, to be a public deterrent for other people.
And specifically, Roman citizens could not be crucified.
Yeah. So when we are looking at Jesus' crucifixion and thinking about it, it needs to be considered within the context that it is a Roman punishment. It is something that the occupying Roman forces did to Jesus. One of the other historical practices and methods of capital punishment, of execution, particularly in the United States, which is where Kay and I both live, and so where our podcast kind of rests its context, is lynching. There's a fantastic book by James Cone called The Cross and the Lynching Tree that I highly recommend for anybody. I mean, it's just a really great book in general. It is one of his more accessible books in terms of theology. It's really accessible to folks without necessarily a master's degree in theology. And it makes the connection, right? Lynching was extrajudicial, so without the justice system, without a trial.
Yes.
Punishment. And so James Cone ties the cross and the lynching tree together, ties crucifixion and in particular Jesus' crucifixion, which happens without a fair trial,
right,
and lynching, which happened every time without a fair trial, and the ways that those two inform each other and help us understand the United States culture better, and particularly physically violent racism.
Now, over the years, there have been efforts to seek, again, so-called humane methods of execution, particularly for state-sanctioned executions, the death penalty, and so on. And I've seen a lot of material on that go back to what in Western civilization was often the most well-known case of the death penalty being carried out by people who were educated in the ancient Greek and Latin civilizations, which was the death of Socrates, who was executed by poison in ancient Greece. And his death was remarkable in that we have an account of it. And it might be somewhat exaggerated, it might be slightly embellished, whatever. But there's the written down story of how it happened. He was describing how he felt as he very slowly died, and the numbness worked its way up his body. And he was having conversations with his friends and others who were there with him at the time. And the reaction that a lot of people had to that story, which was very commonly taught to school children, school boys mostly, in the times I'm talking about, as part of classical Greek literature, because this was, Aristotle writing it down. So it was part of the works of Aristotle. It was a story that was commonly understood by anyone who was known as well-educated in Western civilization for a few hundred years there. And people's reaction to it was, well, that sounds miserable. Let's see if we can find a more humane way of executing people. And so, for example, when it comes to having a gallows for hangings, there are certain requirements in order for that to be so-called humane, because you have to make sure that the death is reasonably quick. In order for that to happen, there has to be a certain amount of drop length, there has to be a certain amount of weight, and the neck has to snap instead of just allowing for suffocation. And famously, the guillotine was developed in France under some rather extraordinary circumstances you may have heard of, to be a alternative to the more common method of execution for nobles at the time, which was decapitation by a sword or axe, which famously included the tradition of tipping the executioner, because you'd give the executioner whatever you could afford on your way to the block, as it were, in order to encourage them to make it quick. And to use a nice sharp blade instead of something that was a little duller. And that was apparently how executioners made a decent amount of their money for a while there in various places.
So Nearly Headless Nick was...
Yes, in Harry Potter.
Probably not a good tipper.
Possibly also, like, he may have just angered the executioner in other ways. If your family has an ongoing feud with the executioner and you're sentenced to death, well, that does not bode well for you at all. So,
also true.
Yeah.
There are also firing squads. It has been one of the methods included, and in those, at least one, if not several people, will have blanks loaded into their guns, and it won't be clear who does, so that... And this is the, humane for the executioner?
Yes.
Kind of sense. So that allows for those who are shooting to hope that they have blanks, that they're not actually
I forgot to throw in there an additional consideration, which is that having more than one person with a blank is fine, but you don't want the majority of people to, because then you come into a question of humaneness for the executed if those with the actual bullets are not as good of a shot as the others.
Yes. So some, but not most.
Right.
And if there are people who just don't fire.
Which happened, apparently, quite a bit, yeah.
It is a thing that we have
historical evidence of.
Well, and it is a bizarre thing that humans in what is called, though somewhat erroneously, a civilized society have had to teach people to more easily kill. And that's part of how the military works. That's why target practice went from being just bullseyes to silhouette. There's all sorts of things that humans have done, particularly in the United States, because that's what we're most familiar with, to make it easier for people to kill people. First-person shooter video games are one of those things, too.
There have been studies done that show that playing a violent video game does not actually increase violence in the person's life.
I'm not saying it increases violence in their life, but, they were developed by the Department of Defense. And funded by the Department of Defense, so that folks that are maybe more likely to go into the military or already were likely to go into the military to make it, it's a whole mental, psychological, terrible thing. But yeah. And then electrocution was basically never all that humane. The Green Mile, I think, goes into it fairly well. I haven't ever actually read, and I haven't watched the entirety of the Green Mile.
Yeah, I have not either. It sounds like exactly the kind of movie that would make me very miserable.
Yeah. And then injection has been considered in this country the most humane for a while. However, it is also problematic because, so there's the humaneness of who does it. You're asking a doctor who literally has taken a vow to do no harm to end someone's life, who does not want to end their life. And there have been supply issues because there are a concoction of 3 drugs that are used in the United States to kill someone. And one of the drugs is made for animals, I think. And the UK manufacturer of that drug found out that they were using it for executions and stopped sending it. And so some states, I think Oklahoma was one of them, were trying to do it with just the 2 drugs, which is not safe and not okay and not legal.
And sometimes not necessarily lethal either.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're at it, if you've ever gone to the doctor's office and needed to get some blood work done and had someone, jab you a few times unsuccessfully, those of us with very tiny veins will understand. It's not just taking blood out of you that is an option for. Sometimes injecting stuff does not go well either.
Mm-hmm.
So I have seen various arguments around the internet, not necessarily scientific ones, but by various historians saying that at this point in history, it's very possible that the guillotine is actually the fastest, most so-called effective, most so-called humane method that we've invented for quickly executing a person and not putting them through extra torture or trial. But still, it's not like there's any such thing as a good option for this. We do not have one. There is no Vulcan neck pinch that can kill someone with a touch instantly. However, if you're looking for death penalty trivia in your life, the word kibosh apparently comes from the Gaelic term for the black cap that British judges used to put on their heads immediately before announcing the death penalty as sort of a symbol of what was about to come. That was the black cap. And the term used for that cap in Irish Gaelic is pronounced kibosh. And so Americans have picked that up and turned it into a slightly different term.
Yeah, I did not know that.
Yeah, the things you discover on Wikipedia.
In the United States, the Supreme Court has upheld the death penalty as not being a cruel or unusual punishment. However, Justice Stephen Breyer, who just retired, and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died in 2020, wrote a dissent to the latest time that the Supreme Court took up the death penalty, pointing to ways that it could be considered cruel and unusual. And one of the ways that particularly I think Justice Ginsburg has pointed out is the length of time that it takes to actually get to the point of the capital punishment, that having someone be in limbo for that long is cruel and unusual. So, and we'll link to a summary of their dissenting opinion for folks who are interested in figuring that, in learning more about that.
Yeah. So what does it say about the death penalty in the Bible? Well, as you may have heard, the Jewish legal code in the Hebrew Scriptures does set the death penalty up as practice for certain crimes. However, if we look at the historical practice of Jewish legal code in the world since then, you will note that rabbinical code developed later on has made it almost impossible to execute someone under those rules.
Mm-hmm. Plus, there's the addition of sanctuary cities and communities where people could go
Yes.
who might be at risk of being killed, particularly if they've committed a crime, and seek sanctuary there. And there's a lot of kind of rules and regulations around that to make it...
Yeah, and come to think of it, going into a fictional example, there was an episode of MASH where a soldier tried to claim sanctuary in the little chapel that Father Mulcahy had set up, and it was not a terrible episode. So they did an interesting job of it.
Yeah. The other thing about the Bible is, so police are mentioned in the Bible a couple times. The majority of the time police are talked about, we're talking about temple police. There's one exception in Acts 16 when Paul and Silas are arrested for exorcising a demon, casting out a demon from a girl, which results in her no longer prophesying for the people who are basically human traffickers and trafficking her. So they stop slavery and are arrested by the police, sent by the magistrate. The rest of the time, the temple police are the only ones that are talked about, that are mentioned when we're mentioning police. And that is once in Acts, but really it's about Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. And so when we're talking about that particular aspect of execution, there is a sense that even the high priest and the Jewish people name that they can't execute Jesus, they can't sentence him to death. So that is something that is done by the state in the Gospels. But yeah. And there are plenty of fictional and speculative fiction methods and alternatives and examples of capital punishment. One that is maybe less immediately thought of is from Lady and the Tramp, and that at the dog pound they talk about the quote-unquote long walk for strays who are not claimed.
Yeah, don't tell me that Disney movies don't handle difficult concepts. So
yeah, they got some tough stuff. Yeah.
There was also a Star Trek Voyager episode called Repentance, in which they rescue some people from a failing starship, and it turns out that the people they rescued are a bunch of prisoners and a few guards, and those prisoners are scheduled to be executed on their home planet, and they're being transported there. However, while they're on board the ship, one of those prisoners is shown to have a medical condition that led him to be extremely aggressive, way more than a usual person. It's basically a defect in his brain, and the doctor on Voyager is able to fix it, and as a result he becomes extremely repentant and cannot believe the things that he's done, and is very contrite, and actually wants to be executed because he can't forgive himself. And after various ongoing plot points, he and the other prisoners are actually returned to their planet to be executed, but he did get a chance to appeal during that process, and they made sure that he had his chance. And the crew of Voyager, who abide by the rules of the United Federation of Planets, are not people who practice the death penalty. The Federation doesn't have the death penalty, and they are horrified by having to do this, but also they are not allowed to interfere in other cultures, according to the Prime Directive. So they do not feel that they have a choice about returning the prisoners to their homeworld.
That's intense.
It was quite an episode. I remember thinking that it was not an easy one, but they handled it pretty well. They definitely gave it the gravity it deserved.
Yeah. I was thinking of the West Wing. In the first season
Yes.
of West Wing, there is an exquisitely done episode called Take This Sabbath. It's episode 14, where the Supreme Court has upheld that. Well, okay. In the episode, a drug dealer's appeal of the death penalty is rejected by the Supreme Court, and so Sam's old high school bully gets involved and it appeals directly to Sam, but it ends up doing a great job of kind of talking through. There's a look at kind of Quaker approaches to that. Toby's rabbi preaches about it on the Sabbath at Shabbat services. So there's a lot. They just do a really good job of getting into the complexities of that. And since President Bartlett is Catholic, there's like a Catholic priest that his like homeschool Catholic priest gets involved, and yeah, it does a really great job. Highly recommend.
Absolutely. Or another TV episode is from the TV show Babylon 5. The episode is called Passing Through Gethsemane. And in the universe of Babylon 5, capital punishment has been replaced by basically complete memory removal and replacement. And they call it the death of personality. Basically, you turn a person into a completely brand new person and have them start a new life totally separate from their old life instead of executing them. And so a man who has become a Christian monk is revealed to have gone through this process when his victim's family tracks him down for revenge. And the really short version of that episode is that the family does eventually succeed in killing him, and the person who is mostly responsible for that also goes through the death of personality and is then sent back to Earth to the monastery of those same monks for training to become a monk. And they do make it clear that not all of the monks in this monastery come from this program directly. But
that would be impressive.
This is one of the places where people who have gone through this can live a new life. And they do take in several people like that.
Yeah. And then in the Hunger Games are in fact a way of executing people.
Just not for crimes.
Yeah, not for crimes. So there's the like used as repression, but then the 75th Hunger Games, so the second one that Katniss is in, it is very clear that they are in it because of what they have been doing in and the like resistance that has been fomenting amongst the district. But they also have other, like they have whipping posts and stuff in the second and third books and those sorts of things. And then if you think about it, for most dystopias, there is some form of capital punishment. It usually involves torture or pain or something that is considered cruel and or unusual. I mean, even when we think about, like, The Giver, right? The ways that the baby who is not thriving is treated and, like, each of those steps along the way. That there's always something that's part of what makes dystopias dystopias.
So as we go into our readings for this episode, our first reading is from Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13 through chapter 53, verse 12. Another servant song from Isaiah. This passage tells us that the servant's sacrifice of his life is successful and brings about forgiveness of sin.
So one of the overarching themes, both in this passage and in the Angel and Buffy series, is suffering as the result of punishment. So Angel, the vampire with a soul, is described wonderfully in verse 14, right? Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance when in vampire form, beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So there's like a great potential description of Angel, but also the approach to Angel's curse of having his soul back is not so that he can make amends and move on, but just like it is literally about eternal suffering, that he can never have pure happiness.
And then in chapter 53, verse 6, we read, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." But not everyone is very familiar with sheep. And so another possible example, of course, would be cats. Especially if you remember that cat herding commercial from a few years ago, which we can link to in our episode description. But like sheep, cats can go astray and are not always that easy to herd in the correct direction. So
they might even be harder than sheep.
yes, I have never actually tried to herd more than one cat at a time. I, for that matter, have also not tried to herd more than one sheep at a time, or indeed one sheep. So I suppose that's not really a fair comparison for me to make, but yeah, I imagine.
And then, so our readings are a little bit different for this episode. There are 2 options for the Hebrews readings, and we're including Psalm 22. We don't often cover Psalms for this podcast, but given that Jesus quotes this psalm while on the cross, we figured it was unusually well known and would be a good one to cover. So Psalm 22 begins with the author asking why they have been abandoned, and is a really beautiful psalm of lament, and a psalm that places God in the role also of midwife, which is beautiful. So one of the themes in this passage is this, especially when taken into the context of Jesus on the cross. It feels very much to me like the author is Katniss calling out to Haymitch during the Hunger Games, right? Saying, why? And then there's like communication from Haymitch in like secretive and tricky ways and all of that stuff. But yeah, the lament.
Sure. In verse 2, we read, "O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest." And this verse very much reminded me of Martin Luther, who both Emily and I know well as a historical figure, who went through a phase during his life of being absolutely convinced he was going to hell because, of course, he sinned and could not possibly be forgiven. And he was constantly over-confessing his sins until his confessor priest gave him a cross and reminded him to trust in Christ's grace. There was probably also some mental health conditions
there were
adding
definitely
to that.
some.
Yeah. I hesitate to diagnose anyone from this far of a standpoint, but yeah, we can say pretty confidently there were some issues there. Ultimately, however, what we learn from this, and that was portrayed pretty well in the 2003 movie Luther, what we learn from this is that this is not a healthy way to go for any real length of time. Sleep is good for you. And so if you find yourself stuck in a similar place, please do seek out help.
Yes, sleep is good. I, however, read verse 6, where it says, "But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people, and thought to myself, ah, so you are the very hungry caterpillar." Or perhaps one of the passengers on James's giant peach. Okay.
Yeah, excellent argument. I approve.
We have to laugh at like some point in the episode, I think.
Yeah, no, we on the one hand we want to give the proper gravity to Good Friday, and on the other hand you also need to have a little escapism. That's what this podcast is for, partly, right?
Yep.
And our next reading is from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 16 through 25. Jesus' death brought about forgiveness of sin, which we remember each time we gather for worship through the liturgy of confession and forgiveness and Holy Communion.
So this passage really, to me, just sounded like the epilogue to Divergent, after like all of the stuff does and does not go down, and the memories are and are not wiped, and they make new covenants and have new agreements about how they will try again to live life together.
Yeah. And then in verse 16 we read, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their hearts, and I will write them on their minds." And so for some people, this verse may immediately bring to mind the ancient Jewish folklore concept of the golem, Golem.
Not to be confused with Smeagol from
who was
Lord of the
Gollum.
Rings.
Yes, that would be very different. And this creature was portrayed in various ancient and modern stories as a clay statue that was brought to life through various magical means, often words written on it or on a scroll put inside of it. The classic, best-known ancient story is called The Golem of Prague. But I personally was first introduced to this folklore idea through Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, specifically the miniseries production of Going Postal, which includes golems recruited to work as postal carriers.
All right.
and the fight to make sure that they were treated well and decently. And of course, they have a union. So it's pretty awesome.
Naturally.
Yeah.
Our other Hebrews reading for this episode is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, and chapter 5, verses 7 through 9. Jesus' role as high priest is explained as connected both to Jesus' humanity and obedience.
And looking at the verses, I read chapter 4, verse 15, which says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin." So, given recent events, I feel that it's necessary for us to strongly urge against compare and contrasting Jesus directly with, say, Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, whether that is from a lay or clergy standpoint. I don't think that that is a good choice to make, particularly if you're preaching, but also just like as a layperson in the pews, comparing anybody with Jesus, including church leaders, of course the person is going to come off badly. That's kind of the point of who Jesus is. But also, while he has been saying some terrible things, it's not like those things are that out of line with a whole bunch of his church leaders from the not even so distant past. Like, let's keep that in mind. While the things he's saying are horrific, that's been heard from the church before and not that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, instead of comparing Jesus's high priestship to actual real-life characters, I would instead suggest going with fictional characters. And a couple I came up with included Kai Wynn from Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, who was a deeply selfish religious leader, but also still had some moral convictions and was never entirely evil, and had a pretty interesting plot arc, and was played beautifully by her actress. She was just fantastic. Or, of course, there's always Imhotep from the 1999 movie, The Mummy, who was not a good person. Never really actually expected to be a good person, as far as I can tell. No one really expected him to be that. But he did have a very effective connection with a source of power of some kind, whether it was divine or simply magical, was left to the imagination. So, like, as a high priest, he was effective in that way.
Yeah, effective and with sin. Okay, got it. And then in chapter 5, verse 7, we read, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission." Yay, emotions! Way to go, Jesus. Feel those feelings. I do indeed believe that Inside Out would be very proud of you for that. I also am a little bit curious, like, which all of the emotions would have been kind of at work at that point, but
Yeah.
it's okay to have more than one.
And then our final reading is from John chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 19, verse 42. Yes, that is full 2 chapters of John. This is a long reading.
And if you're interested in this particular reading being parsed out more into smaller subsections, such as the sections that might be read for a Tenebrae service or something, you can check out our Good Friday episode from last year with special guest Jessica Davis, and we'll link to that in the show notes.
Absolutely. It was a great episode. However, this year, we decided to be a little bit more
reasonable.
Concise. The Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus' arrest, torture, state-sanctioned and extrajudicial killing, and burial.
So one of the obvious themes in this passage is extrajudicial, which is to say without fair trial, state-sanctioned, which is with the approval of the state, killing, which is basically the Hunger Games, but with only one contestant in this case and no winner.
Yeah.
I mean, you get all the worst things of it, and
pretty much.
If you're going with the, like, Stations of the Cross part, you even get the, like, little parachute things of, like, someone giving Jesus a cloth to wipe with, or Simeon carrying the cross for Jesus for a little bit. So. And then in the verses in chapter 8, verse 17, we read, "The woman said to Peter, 'You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?' Peter said, 'I am not.'" This is the middle of Peter's 3 denials, and we've talked about this, I think I've talked about this more this year than I have in the past, but Judas is always the one that gets blamed for being the betrayer.
Yeah.
and Peter's the denier, but I don't think that those are I think that's a false binary to say that betrayal and denial are two totally different things. They're two sides to the same coin. But it made me think of the Lord of the Rings and the way that the Ring of Power causes all kinds of betrayals. So it causes betrayals by the people who wear it, by the people who are around it. All of them betray each other, betray their ideals, betray themselves, lots of betrayal, and it looks different for everybody.
And then in chapter 19, verse 39, we read, Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. And I would just like to point out, for those who are imagining this scene playing out in a portrayal of some kind, or who have seen it in plays and so on, whether you choose to imagine Nicodemus as a secret bodybuilder, like Uncle Iroh eventually became in Avatar: The Last Airbender, or if you would prefer to think that he had a wheelbarrow or a wagon of some sort, like the cabbage merchant in the same show, known famously for, oh no, my cabbages, is entirely up to you. The text does not say you have complete poetic license to take with that. Enjoy yourself, by all means. I kind of doubt that he was levitating the stuff, but I suppose you actually have room for that too.
Right?
So
you could
technically
go for
speaking,
charmed, yeah.
Yeah, there are always more possibilities.
Indeed. And now for our newest segment, Let's Make a Muppets Musical. This is, of course, a little bit of a trickier one this week because
we have
Muppets
generally agreed not to cast Jesus yet because we're still getting into this, and also the only actual story that we have here is Jesus's death and crucifixion. So
it's a little tricky, but we were talking, and I think that just the little part that is the wordplay and exchange between Pilate and Jesus would make for a spectacular scene with a Muppet and a human.
Yes. But then the question is, which one is the Muppet and which one is the human? Because
right.
I am on the side of the frustration that Pilate has is the funny part, and therefore that should be portrayed by a Muppet. And I can absolutely see the frowny face that so many of the Muppets would be making.
Right. And I, initially at least, was thinking of the guy who played Ebenezer Scrooge in the Muppets Christmas Carol as Pilate.
I'm pretty sure that's Michael Caine.
Yes, Michael Caine trying with all seriousness to get a clear answer out of Jesus, and Jesus being a Muppet and just ridiculous.
To be fair, I can totally see Michael Caine pulling that off. So right? Yeah, I don't know that he'd volunteer for it, but
yeah, but I don't know which Muppets.
Yeah, I'm unclear on the Muppets. So, dear listeners, if you have thoughts on that, please let us know.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Easter Sunday. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.